The throne hall of the Endless Dominion was built to make gods feel small, and Emperor Voiditer liked it that way. Black stone pillars, harvested from a dead world, rose 400 feet into a ceiling painted with the collapse of stars. 12,000 nobles filled the tiered galleries, their crimson robes rustling like a tide, waiting for the entertainment to begin. On the great floating display above the throne, a tactical map of the Perseus arm rotated slowly. Red icons, human systems, blinked out one by one, swallowed by the golden tide of the advance. It had been 3 years of war and had grown bored of victory. Real victory required an audience who still remembered what defeat looked like. Your eternity. Grand Admiral knelt at the base of the throne, his 4 eyes lowered in the customary display of submission. The human colonial fleet has surrendered its final defensive position at Meridian Station. Only stragglers remain. Show me something worth watching, Admiral, or leave my sight. Gestured, and the display shifted. A single ship appeared, small and broken, crawling through a debris field on a trajectory that made no strategic sense at all. Its hull was scorched black along one flank. One of its 2 engine nacelles trailed a thin ribbon of atmosphere venting into vacuum. This vessel, your eternity, the ISS Kestrel Vane, broke from the human retreat 11 days ago. It is heading directly for here. The throne hall went silent, and then it did not. The laughter started in the front rows and rolled backward through the galleries like a wave breaking on a shore, nobles clutching each other, wiping tears from reptilian eyes, banging jeweled fists against the stone railings. A single ship. One crippled, dying human warship, sailing alone toward the beating heart of an empire that spanned 11,000 star systems, defended by fleets that could blot out a sun. Rose from his throne, 6.5 feet of violet-scaled muscle wrapped in ceremonial black, and he laughed loudest of all, a deep, rolling sound that seemed to shake dust from the ancient pillars. "A funeral procession," he said when he could speak again, wiping moisture from beneath one golden eye. "They send us a funeral procession and call it a war." He turned to, still grinning. "Do not destroy it. Let it come. Let the whole empire watch a human commander sail into our capital believing they have some final, desperate trick. I want it broadcast to every colony world. I want children to laugh at this before they learn their letters. Bowed lower, as you command, your eternity." Far across the star-flecked dark, aboard the Kestrel Vane's cramped and shuddering bridge, Fleet Commander watched the same tactical feed that did. Pirated, delayed, grainy, and saw the Emperor's laughing face fill the main screen for 3 full seconds before the feed cut to static. Her helmsman, a 19-year-old named who had lied about his age to enlist, looked over at her with the particular fear of someone who has just watched 12,000 aliens laugh at his death sentence. "Commander," he said carefully, "should we be worried they think this is funny?" Did not look away from the star map. Her reflection sat faint and steady in the dark glass. No fear in it, no tremor, just the flat, patient calm of someone who had already done the arithmetic and found the answer she wanted. "Let them laugh, mister," she said quietly. "It's cheaper than shields." Behind her, in the ship's aft cargo bay, sealed behind 3 layers of security clearance even her own crew didn't have full access to, something in the dark began, almost imperceptibly, to hum. 4 months earlier, in a bunker 200 meters beneath the ruins of what had once been Geneva, humanity's high command had gathered around a table to discuss how to die with dignity. That was how Admiral had put it, bluntly, in front of 11 exhausted flag officers and the last 3 heads of state who still had governments worth the name. The Sol defense line was gone. 40% of humanity's crewed warships were gone with it. The advance had not slowed in 3 years, and every projection on the table said the same thing in different colors of red. Total defeat within 18 months, full occupation within 3 years. "We build one more fleet," General said, tired past the point of caring how it sounded. "We throw everything we have left at them in one battle. At least we go down fighting." It was then a mid-ranked strike commander with a service record longer than officers twice her age, who stood up and said the fleet plan was suicide dressed up as courage, and that courage wasn't what they needed. Intelligence was. She'd spent the walk to that meeting rehearsing the pitch in her head because she knew exactly how insane it would sound out loud. One ship, not a fleet. One ship sent alone deep into territory, carrying no weapon capable of hurting them at all. The room had laughed at her too, the first time a different kind of laughter than tired and bitter rather than cruel, but laughter all the same, until Doctor stood up beside her. was not a soldier. He was a systems theorist who'd spent 15 years before the war studying communications intercepts, an obsessive, rumpled man who talked too fast and had been quietly convinced for years of something nobody wanted to hear, that the Empire's endless, grinding expansion made no logical sense for a species with their level of technology and resource access. Empires that vast didn't need to conquer. Something else was driving it. Something structural, buried in how their society was held together. And if that was true, the war wasn't really about territory at all. It was about a lie that needed enemies to survive. "You can't shoot down a lie with a battleship," told the room. "But you can deliver one, straight into their command networks. If I'm right about what's underneath their war machine, we don't need to beat them militarily. We need them to find out the truth before we run out of ships to lose." What he proposed wasn't a weapon. It was a swarm trillions of self-replicating nanoscale drones, dormant and inert, engineered to read as scrap metal and debris to sensors calibrated to hunt for mass, power signatures, weapons platforms. Seated quietly across a ship's hull and wake during a long, dangerous journey deep into enemy space, they would drift, replicate using whatever raw material they touched, and wait until they had infiltrated enough infrastructure to do what no fleet ever could: tell the truth to an entire empire at once. It took 3 weeks to get the plan approved, and only because there was nothing left to lose by trying it. She insisted on commanding the ship herself. When asked her why, she gave him the only honest answer she had. "Because somebody is going to have to sit in that throne room and make them believe it's real," she said. "And I'd rather it be someone who volunteered." They built the Kestrel Vane in 11 weeks, gutting a mid-size cruiser down to a shell that could survive just long enough, no more hiding, payload behind 3 false bulkheads, and a cover story fed to her own crew that the mission was reconnaissance. Only and her second officer knew the truth. It was safer that way. Fear was easier to fake when the people around you were feeling it for real. The last thing told her, standing on the launch deck with his hands shaking, wasn't a technical briefing. It was a warning. "Once it starts broadcasting, you won't be able to stop it, and neither will they," he said. "Empires built on lies don't come apart slowly, Commander. They come apart all at once. You need to still be standing when it happens." Had nodded, boarded the ship, and not looked back. They called it an escort. The Kestrel Vane's crew called it something closer to torture. 3 cruisers flanked them at every jump point, close enough that their weapons batteries were visible on the Kestrel Vane's cracked forward viewport, never firing, never quite finishing what a single volley could have ended in seconds. This order had traveled fast. The human ship was a spectacle, and spectacles needed to survive long enough to be watched. So the crews toyed instead, clipping the Kestrel Vane's shields with warning shots timed to look like near misses, forcing evasive maneuvers that shredded what little remained of her structural integrity, broadcasting mocking transmissions across open channels that made sure her crew could hear. It worked exactly as had predicted. It also nearly broke her people. Lieutenant stopped sleeping around the 2nd week. Chief Engineer Park, who'd kept the ship's failing reactor core stable through 4 increasingly severe incidents, started every status report with the same flat question: "Are we actually trying to survive this, Commander, or are we just delaying it?" Couldn't answer honestly. She lied instead, told her crew there was a rendezvous point, a rescue plan, an exit strategy that existed only on paper she'd never shown anyone. It was the hardest kind of lying, the kind you told people you respected, for their own good, while watching them slowly work out that something didn't add up. What none of them could see, what only the ship's automated systems and a hidden log only could access were tracking, was the true mission succeeding around them in silence. Every near collision, every scrape of weapons fire along the Kestrel Vane's hull, every piece of debris that spun off into the dark during evasive maneuvers, carried invisible cargo. Drones, disguised as scorched hull fragments and drifting wreckage, bled out of the ship by the billions, tumbling into the void behind them, inert and patient, waiting on contact with any vessel, station, or debris field to begin the slow work of replication. By the time the Kestrel Vane crossed into the outer here system, the swarm numbered in the trillions, distributed silently across half a dozen capital ships, 3 orbital shipyards, and the hull of the very cruiser escorting them, entirely undetected because nothing about it registered as a threat. It looked like garbage. Nobody scans garbage for secrets. The tension aboard the Kestrel Vane nearly broke on the 14th day, when Park confronted directly on the bridge. in front of the crew, voice shaking with something between fury and grief. "I've kept this reactor from killing all of us 4 times now," she said. "I want to know if there's a reason, Commander, or if we're just here so they have something to laugh at before they kill us." The whole bridge went silent, stared at his console like it might save him from the moment. Could have lied again. She'd been lying for 2 weeks. Instead, she made a choice that would matter more later than she understood at the time. "There's a reason," she said. "I can't tell you what it is yet. I need you to trust me for a few more days. If I'm wrong, it won't matter. We'll be dead either way, and it won't have cost you anything you weren't already risking. But if I'm right, everything we've done out here is going to matter more than any battle either of us has ever fought." It wasn't much. It wasn't a full truth. But something in his voice, steady, certain, utterly without the tremor of someone bluffing, was enough. Park held her eyes a long moment, then nodded once and went back to her station without another word. 2 days later, scorched, venting atmosphere from 6 separate hull breaches, running on backup power with her main reactor barely holding, the Kestrel vein dropped out of transit above here, of the Empire, and Emperor Voiditer's throne hall erupted into applause. Here from orbit looked like a jewel wrapped in golden light, 3 moons, ring cities strung like beads around its equator, built by a species that had never once, in 1,000 years, imagined losing a war on its own doorstep. The Kestrel vein hung above it like a piece of wreckage that had wandered in from some other, grimmer story, and every sensor on the planet, and its orbital defenses turned to watch it burn quietly in the dark. Its demand arrived within the hour, translated crudely into human standard by a linguistic officer who took obvious pleasure in the wording. The human commander will be brought before the Emperor alive, to kneel before the throne that ends her species' war. Had expected this, had counted on it. An emperor who wanted a captured commander paraded before his court wasn't an emperor who wanted her ship destroyed outright. He wanted a story, a symbol, a moment his empire would remember. That vanity was the last gap in the plan, and walked through it with her hands raised and her uniform deliberately left torn and scorched from the journey, because a defeated woman was exactly what expected to see. The throne hall was worse in person than any transmission had shown. 12,000 nobles packed the galleries, their voices a low roar of anticipation as guards marched down the long black aisle toward the throne, her wrists bound in restraint cuffs that hummed faintly against her skin. She kept her chin level. She counted her steps. She did not look at the crowd because it told her, half joking, half deadly serious, that an audience feeds on fear, and she intended to starve them. Rose from his throne as she reached its base, and up close he was even larger than the broadcast suggested, violet-scaled, gold-eyed, radiating the easy, contemptuous confidence of a being who had never once in his long reign been made to answer for anything. "So," he said, his translated voice booming through hidden speakers to the furthest gallery seats, "this is the great commander who sailed a funeral ship into my empire's heart." He circled her slowly, inspecting her the way one might inspect a strange animal. "Tell me, Commander, I did learn your name. It seemed only respectful. What was the plan? Did your species truly believe one broken ship could matter at the end of everything?" Lifted her eyes to meet his. "It already has your eternity," she said. "You just haven't noticed yet." The court laughed, a great rolling wave of it, thousands of voices, and laughed loudest, throwing his head back, delighted by what he took for delusion, or perhaps the last defiant flailing of a broken species refusing to admit its extinction was already written. He leaned down close to her, still smiling, and said the words that would echo later across 1,000 worlds, translated into every language of the Empire, replayed on broadcasts that drones would ensure nobody could stop. "Your entire war," said, "has been a beautiful, doomed joke, and I have enjoyed every moment of it." Held his gaze and did not flinch, did not look away, did not give him the fear he wanted. "Laugh while you can," she said quietly, so only he and the nearest guards could hear. "You won't get another chance." Smile faltered for exactly 1/2 of 1 second, the first crack, so small no one else in that vast hall noticed it, before he straightened, waved a dismissive hand, and ordered her held in the palace's high-security wing pending a public execution to be staged for maximum theater in 3 days' time. As guards led her away down the long black aisle, allowed herself, for the first time in the entire mission, something close to a genuine smile. 3 days had told her the swarm needed, at most, 48 hours from full palace infiltration to activation. She had time to spare. There is no sound in the space between a ship's hull and the void, And there was no sound either in the vast dark network of a trillion drones finally, silently doing the work they had crossed the stars to do. They had spent 11 days replicating quietly through here's orbital shipyards, using scrap metal and industrial waste as raw material, invisible to sensors that had never been designed to look for something this small, this patient, this uninterested in destruction. By the time knelt before throne, the swarm had already achieved what, back on the launch deck of a bunker 200 meters under the ruins of Geneva, had promised was possible. Full penetration of the Empire's primary command and communications infrastructure. Root access built one microscopic connection at a time, threading through data cables and cooling systems and command relays like ivy growing through the cracks of a wall nobody had thought to check. What the drones found, once inside, confirmed everything it spent 15 years suspecting and had never been able to prove. The Empire's war was not a war of necessity, it was a war of maintenance. Buried in encrypted archives accessible only to the ruling caste, the Void-Eater dynasty and its inner council was the true architecture of society. 1,000 worlds held together not by shared purpose, but by a manufactured, centuries-old narrative of perpetual existential threat, updated and refreshed with each new war, each new enemy, because a population convinced it was fighting for survival never asked why its rulers held so much power, why resources flowed upward instead of outward, why dissent had been quietly, efficiently eliminated for generations. Humanity had not been chosen as an enemy because humanity threatened the Empire. Humanity had been chosen because the Empire needed someone, and the fledgling human colonies, isolated and unprepared, had been convenient. There were internal council recordings, the drones found them against a dozen cross-referenced archives, of ministers discussing, in flat administrative language, the narrative requirements of the human campaign. Casualty projections weighed not against military necessity, but against public cohesion metrics. An entire species being ground down in a war built, at its foundation, on a lie its architects didn't even bother to disguise from each other. Its design for what came next had one guiding principle drilled into during their final briefing: don't destroy anything, show them. At the precise moment was being marched into her holding cell in the palace's high-security wing. 41 hours after the swarm's full infiltration, the broadcast began. It did not look like an attack. There were no explosions, no failed systems, no alarms. Every screen, terminal, personal comm device, and public display across the Empire, 11,000 star systems, 1,000 inhabited worlds, trillions of citizens, flickered simultaneously and began playing the same recording. Council ministers discussing narrative requirements in board, administrative tones, timestamps, and authentication codes displayed alongside. Undeniable, sourced directly from the Empire's own sealed archives. It played in every language of the Empire at once. It played for 6 minutes, and then it played again. In the throne hall, Grand Admiral watched the broadcast begin on a side display and felt something in his chest go cold and still, because he recognized the recording immediately. He had been in the room 20 years earlier when that meeting was held, and he had told himself for 2 decades that the war was necessary, that the threat was real, that he served something larger than himself. Across here, in ring cities and orbital stations and surface settlements, 12 billion citizens stopped what they were doing and watched their own government explain, in its own words, exactly how it had lied to them. The first sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong reached not through his ministers, but through the sound of his own throne hall. He was 3 hours into planning the theatrical details of its execution, the lighting, the broadcast angles, the precise phrasing of his victory address, when the great doors of the hall burst open and Grand Admiral entered without ceremony, without kneeling, his 4 eyes wide with something had never seen on his most trusted officer's face before: doubt. "Your Eternity," said his voice unsteady, "you need to see this." The broadcast was already 6 hours old by the time it reached the throne hall's main display, and it had not stopped playing once. Watched his own ministers, recorded decades and years and months apart, discussing the human war and a dozen wars before it in the flat, bureaucratic language of population management. He watched the recording cite casualty numbers not as tragedies, but as acceptable narrative cost. He watched with mounting fury and something colder underneath the fury, as the authentication codes scrolled beside each clip, each one traceable, each one real. each one drawn from archives that only the highest levels of his own government were supposed to be able to access. "Find whoever did this," roared, "and bring me their head before." "Your eternity." His voice cracked through the imperial fury with something that had never happened before in its reign: interruption. "It is not one broadcast, it is every screen, every system, every world. It has been playing for 6 hours and we cannot locate its source or stop its transmission. Fleet Command reports crews refusing orders on 9 ships. There are riots beginning on the ring cities. Your eternity, the people are not confused. They believe it." Because it was true, and something in every citizen watching had recognized that truth instantly, the way a body recognizes poison before the mind can name it. Generations of accumulated small doubts. Why the wars never ended, why resources never seemed to reach the people who needed them, why questioning the ruling caste's decisions had quietly become dangerous, collapsed all at once into a single, undeniable confirmation. Across the Empire, the fracture spread with a speed that stunned even, monitoring what data he could intercept from a listening post 200 light-years away. Hands shaking as he watched projections he'd modeled for months unfold faster and more completely than his most optimistic estimates. Colony governors on outer worlds, already resentful of a capital that took more than it gave, declared local autonomy within a day. Military units, their loyalty built on a narrative that had just been exposed as manufactured, split between those defending the old order out of habit and those refusing to fire on their own citizens. The ring cities of here itself, closest to the throne, erupted into the largest public demonstrations they had seen in 3 centuries, not riots, in the end, those ministers called them that. Crowds, silent and furious, gathering outside the palace gates, holding up recordings of their own leaders' voices on handheld screens. Stood at a high window of the endless dominion, looking down at a sea of his own people he no longer recognized, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man realizing his entire life's foundation had been built on sand, that he was not watching the collapse of an enemy's war effort. He was watching the collapse of his own empire's ability to lie to itself. "Bring me the human commander," he said quietly, without turning from the window. Now, they dragged from her cell with less ceremony than they'd used to march her into the throne hall 3 days earlier, and she understood from the fear in the guards' faces, from the way they wouldn't meet her eyes, that whatever drones had unleashed was already bigger than anyone on either side could fully control. The throne hall was different now. Fewer nobles in the galleries, many had fled to secure their own estates, their own power bases, as reports of unrest spread. The ones who remained wore expressions recognized from 3 years of war. Fear disguised as anger, uncertainty disguised as resolve. Stood at the base of his own throne rather than seated upon it, and that alone told her everything about how the balance in the room had shifted. "You did this?" His voice, still translated, still booming, had lost the easy contempt of 3 days before. What remained underneath was something. "Whatever this broadcast is, whatever plague you've released into my systems, you did this." "We told the truth," said, and let the words land without flinching. "Your empire did the rest." Crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, close enough that his guards tensed, close enough that could feel the heat radiating off his scaled skin. "I will execute you here now in front of everyone and broadcast it across every world that dares to question me, and this will end." "Will it?" Held his gaze steady because she understood, the way had told her she would need to, standing on that launch deck months and a lifetime ago, that this was the moment the entire mission had been built toward. Not the drones, not the infiltration, not even the broadcast itself, but this. A single human commander, unarmed in chains, refusing to be afraid in front of an empire watching to see whether fear was still the only answer. "Killing me won't unbroadcast the truth, your eternity. It'll just be the last thing your people watch you do before they stop believing you're worth following at all." His hand moved to the ceremonial blade at his side, and stopped, because his voice cut across the hall, sharp with something that had never before been directed at the Emperor in 3 decades of service. "Your eternity, don't." Every eye in the hall turned to the Grand Admiral, turned too, slowly, disbelief written across every violet-scaled feature. "You would defy me, now, here." "I have served you and your dynasty for 30 years, said, and his voice shook, but he did not lower his eyes. "I believed every war we fought was necessary. I have watched that recording 11 times, your eternity, and I recognize my own voice in one of the meetings it shows. I helped build the lie we have both been living inside." He drew a slow breath. If you execute this woman now in front of a court that has already seen the truth, you will not be restoring order. You will be proving, in the last way you have left, that everything the broadcast said about you is correct." The silence that followed was the loudest thing it heard since the throne hall doors first opened 3 days earlier. Looked at his blade, at the thinned ranks of his own court, its unbroken stare, and understood, in the particular vertiginous way that certain moments make understanding unavoidable, that the empire he had inherited, the empire built by 100 generations of void eaters before him, had already ended. Not in this room, not with this blade. It had ended 6 hours into a broadcast he could not stop, watched by 12 billion people who no longer needed his permission to know the truth. He lowered the blade. It was, would later say, the single bravest and most cowardly act she ever witnessed an enemy commit in the same motion. "Take her to the council chamber," said, his voice hollow now, stripped of every ounce of the laughter that had filled this room 3 days before. "It seems," he added almost to himself, "we have a war to end." Peace negotiations took 11 days, conducted not in the grand throne hall, but in a smaller council chamber where the light was better and the audience, mercifully, was gone. Was not deposed by an invading army, or a rival empire, or even, in the end, by humanity at all. He was deposed by his own provisional council, formed in the chaotic days after the broadcast, made up of ministers and admirals, chief among them, who understood that no government built on the lie the recordings exposed could survive contact with a population that had finally seen it clearly. The dynasty that had ruled the empire for 4 centuries stepped down not in disgrace exactly, though there was plenty of that, but in the recognition that legitimacy, once broken this completely, could not be threatened back into place. Sat across the table from emperor no longer, but interim first minister of a council that hadn't yet decided what to call itself, through most of those 11 days, and found herself, more than once, negotiating not as a conqueror dictating terms to the defeated, but as something closer to a witness helping a shattered institution figure out what came next. Humanity had not won a war of conquest. There was no territory to claim, no fleet to parade home in triumph. What ended instead was the war's premise, the fabricated threat that had justified it in the first place, and once that premise collapsed, neither side had anything left worth fighting for. The formal armistice, when it was finally signed, made no mention of victors or vanquished. It spoke instead of a shared reckoning. The empire, restructuring into something its own people would need years to define, and humanity's fledgling colonies, still bruised and battered but no longer facing annihilation, beginning the long, uncertain work of figuring out what peace with a civilization 11,000 systems wide might actually look like. Doctor arrived on here 6 weeks later, nervous and rumpled as ever, to help the new Provisional Council understand exactly what his drones had done, and more urgently, how to make sure nothing like his design could ever be used against anyone again, a condition he'd insisted on before agreeing to travel there at all. He found on an observation deck overlooking the ring cities, watching citizens rebuild sections of the capital damaged in the chaotic days of the broadcast, and stood beside her a long moment before either of them spoke. "I keep thinking about what's said to you," said eventually, "in the throne hall about it all being a joke." He wasn't wrong to laugh at first, said, "One ship against an empire that size, it should have been a joke." She watched a repair crew, workers, human colonial engineers among them now, part of the first joint reconstruction teams, hauling scaffolding up the side of a damaged tower. We just needed him to keep laughing long enough to stop looking at what the ship was actually carrying. The Kestrel Vane itself never flew again. Too damaged, too old, its systems too degraded by the journey that had made it, however briefly, the most consequential vessel in the history of human. Instead, the Joint Council, human and both, an arrangement that would have been unthinkable a year earlier, voted to keep her exactly where she'd first entered here orbit, tethered in a stable position above the ring cities, her scorched hull and torn nacelle left untouched, deliberately unrepaired. Not a monument to a battle one. There had been no battle, not in any sense either species would once have recognized. A monument instead to something rarer and stranger. A war that ended not because one side destroyed the other, but because the truth, once it finally reached the people who needed to hear it, turned out to be the only weapon that mattered at all. Stood on that observation deck a long time after had gone back inside, looking up at the small, dark shape of her old ship silhouetted against here's golden rings, and thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, about an emperor who had laughed at one broken human warship. and how right he had been to think it looked like nothing at all.